Alright, so I'm going to talk about the state of Reaper in the current meta. I'm also going to mention a little bit about Scourge. I'm not going to go too much into Scourge. I'm probably going to make a separate video for that. I was originally going to put it all into one video, but I've got too much to talk about. So I originally intended to make this video the week after the balance patch, but a lot of real life things happened. And I've been really busy, so I haven't had the time to do it. And also, another thing that pushed it back is the patch actually really changed how Necro Theory Crafting works, which wasn't... or, sorry, Reaper Theory Crafting works, which wasn't something that I was expecting, because the patch seemed like a straight buff to me, so I didn't expect it to change the builds for Reaper, but it actually caused a huge effect on how build crafting works, which I'm going to go into. And of course some of the meta changes that also occurred after that patch have also really affected how you play a Reaper. So I'll go into that as well. So basically, to sum up the balance patch, is all of our Shroud skills in Reaper Shroud got huge damage buffs. So all of your Shroud skills now hit like trucks. Like, you know, seeing 5-digit Soul Spiral damage numbers is the norm now. Like, that's standard. In fact, I can easily hit 10k even running a Paladin's build with Soul Spiral. Like, you can do a ton of damage now with those skills, which is good, A+. But they also increase the rate at which Shroud degenerates from 3% to 5%. So you don't have as much Shroud. Now, in the original the original video about the balance patch, I kind of wrote that change off as relatively inconsequential, which, you know, there was good precedence for saying that, because the last time they increased our degeneration was the August patch, where they increased our Shroud degeneration from 2% to 3%. That's assuming you were running Vital Persistence, because for those of you that don't remember, used to be Vital, or base degeneration was 4%, and then Vital Persistence would reduce that to 2%, and then in August they changed it to Vital Persistence no longer affects Shroud degeneration, and they just changed our Shroud degeneration to 3% after the forums exploded all over them for making that, for getting rid of the degeneration reduction from Vital Persistence. And that change, it didn't affect anything. Like, I hardly noticed that degeneration change in my gameplay. Like, it really didn't matter much. But in this last patch where they moved it to 5%, something about that 5% number, it's like there was a line that got crossed. And all of a sudden that degeneration really matters now. And that wasn't something I was expecting. Because, I mean, shoot, I used to run builds that didn't even have Soul Reaping, and I had 4% degeneration back then. And again, it wasn't much, but something about 5%. There's just like a line right at 4% that says any further equals doom. And they cross that line. And that's really changed up Buildcraft. Because basically, I used to drown in Life Force. Before the patch, the biggest concern was Shroud cooldown. Can my Shroud come off cooldown when I need it? It was not, do I have enough Life Force? Because the answer was, I always have enough Life Force. Now, that's not always a given anymore. Even running Blighter's builds, like, it's not a given that you're going to have a lot of Life Force to work with. And because it degenerates so fast, like, you're not going to be able to stay long. Like, I'm actually bottoming out my Shroud a lot. And what I mean by bottoming out is I'm in Shroud all the way to 0 Life Force when I get kicked. And that actually happens a lot now. Before, that was rare. You know, it generally only happened if I was getting tunneled by multiple people. Nowadays, it can actually happen even in a 1v1 where you'll bottom out your Life Force. That's a pretty big change, and that has completely changed how I've had to play my Necro. Or my Necro. Because, again, you can't just sit in it all the time. Like, before Necro build crafting, it was all about Shroud. Like, Shroud was your defense. It was the end-all be-all of Necro defense. You just built, you know, you ran Vitality all the time so that you'd have a bigger Life Force pool, and you ran Soul Reaping so you could get all the Life Force generation. And again, it also has a trait in Soul Reaping that increases the size of your Shroud pool. Is all about, you know, making your Shroud as big and fat as possible so that you had the best Shroud available. And you didn't really worry about other defensive means because, you know, Shroud was the best defense available. But since your degeneration's so high, yeah, you can still use it as a defense, but if you're using Shroud as your mainline defense now, it hurts your ability to use it as an offensive tool, because again, you'll just get pushed out of it so fast that you can't really be doing Shroud combos if you're also using it to take damage with. And of course, since we've gotten all these lovely damage bonuses to Reaper's Shroud, you want to be using Reaper's Shroud for its offense. You don't want to be wasting it buffering damage. You know, you kind of, before Shroud was cheap, you could use it whenever you wanted as long as it wasn't on its 10-second cooldown. You know, it was a low power but easy access, so you used it all the time. Now it's a high power Shroud, but you have very low access, so it's something you only want to use right when you've got the perfect opportunity to blow someone's head off with that, you know, 12k soul spiral or that 9k death charge. So there's kind of been a shift there. You want to avoid using Shroud to buffer damage nowadays instead of using it to buffer damage all the time. And to that end, you see, or sorry, to that end, it results in what you see here. And this has kind of been the build that I've found the most success with post-patch. You'll notice I've ditched Soul Reaping because I'm no longer building around just Shroud all the time. I'm using Blood Magic for the heals, again, to try and augment my sustain that is not dependent on Shroud. So again, stacking heals, because, you know, I'm a Necro. I don't have blocks like all the certain classes I could name, so I gotta stack defense somewhere else. So where do I go? I go to Blood Magic, because it gives me extra heals, and it also gives me protection when I cast Wells. That's why I'm running Wells now, is so I can cast it on myself for protection, for all that extra power defense. And I'm running a Paladin's Amulet now, again, because it gives me that toughness and vitality, so I've got a really good defensive stat allocation on this amulet. Again, all to help my survivability without being dependent on Shroud. And another thing about Paladins is because of Awaken the Pain increasing how effective Might is, if you run a Might stacking build with Paladins, it's not actually all that much of a damage loss over Marauder, but it's a huge increase in survivability, and that's another reason I made that shift. It is still a strict damage loss, but since you make so much power up with a Might stacking build with Awaken the Pain, it's still very valid damage. I can still easily do very high damage numbers with this setup. And of course, another thing I did is, you'll notice I'm taking Relentless Pursuit. I dropped my Shout trait, and I dropped my Shout runes for Hullbrack, so that's just, you know, 175 base power with more Might generation as well. And these are all changes that have occurred because of that balance patch. And also shifts in the meta, because the balance patch also converted us into a purely Scourge meta. I wouldn't say a purely Scourge meta, it's a Scourge and Firebrand meta, with a side of Mirage. And that's also kind of what happened here with my traits. Like, I dropped Shouts for Relentless Pursuit, because I really like Relentless Pursuit when dealing with Necro, or sorry, with Scourge. You can't really, it's kind of a hard habit to break, but because, you know, we have two elites now, you can't just say Necro and have people know what you're talking about. So with Scourge, it pukes out Cripple everywhere, so Relentless Pursuit's really nice to have nowadays. And then I just take Hullbrack because, hey, it's got another 20% condition duration reduction, which is also really nice, because you just can't cleanse everything a Scourge throws at you, so having a little bit of duration reduction is nice. And that's the big thing there. And of course, more Might generation equals more Blighter's Boon, which is both good for generating Life Force, which, you know, is important since you spend Life Force really fast now. And it's also more healing in Shroud. That's another thing, your Shroud's really short now, so you kind of, when you go into Shroud, you want to, whatever you want to do in Shroud, you need to do it immediately. So if you want to use Shroud to nuke someone, which is, you know, primarily what you want to be doing, because it is a very good offensive tool, the best offensive tool on Reaper right now. You want to stack as much damage right at the front, and that's something else I've been doing with my build crafting now. You'll notice I have battle sigils on both weapons. Entering Shroud counts as a weapon swap, which means I hit Shroud, I get 4 stacks of might from these sigils, assuming it's not on cooldown. And then I've got Awaken of Pain, which gives me 5 stacks of might on entering Shroud. So right there, I enter Shroud, I get 9 stacks of might right off the bat. For 6 seconds. So I got 6 seconds, which, you know, chances are I'm probably not going to be in Shroud longer than 6 seconds, because again, it doesn't last long, and you don't want to be sitting in it wasting your duration any more than you have to. So I've got 6 seconds of this huge power boost that I can use to just blow someone's head off, which is kind of what I was doing with all this might stacking shenanigans. And of course, actually running this build also allows you to actually sit at 25 stacks of might all the time, which again, with Awaken of Pain, that's 1,000 power. At 25 stacks of might, you have 1,000 power from those might stacks with Awaken the Pain. That's a pretty huge damage bonus. I will say, if you are not into stacking might sigils with might runes, don't run Awaken the Pain. Awaken the Pain is only really useful if you're stacking a lot of might. Otherwise, Chill of Death's better. Another nice thing I did there is, again, since you don't want to buffer damage anymore with Shroud, you go a lot more towards getting as much healing as you can, and one good source of healing is Blighter's Boon in Shroud. So by stacking all this boon generation when you enter Shroud, because you know you get 5 stacks from Awaken the Pain, 4 stacks from Battle Sigils, you get Retaliation on Shroud Enter from Spiteful Spirit. You got all those boons going off when you enter Shroud, and every single instance of those boon is a Blighter's Boon proc. So you can actually get about 2,000 healing from all those boons together just from entering Shroud. That's pretty good. Especially considering that's not a heal skill. I mean, yeah, it's nothing like a real heal skill, but that's actually a pretty decent amount of burst healing. And of course, Life Leeches do work in Shroud as well. So it's kind of, you know, you enter Shroud, you get a huge boost to damage for a short duration, you get a little boost to healing, just a little bit. So it's kind of a huge sea change right there. It's kind of weird to work with it the first time. It didn't take me too long to acclimate to it, because I've always kind of had, you know, a habit of using Shroud in short durations. But I know a lot of people that really like Shroud sitting for defenses have had a lot of trouble transitioning, and it does take a while to get used to. I used to be a chronic Shroud sitter. I don't do that anymore. So it can be a bit difficult to transition to this new way of playing Necro, where you're primarily out of Shroud most of the time. And you're primarily thinking about, how do I avoid using Shroud to defend myself, and instead use these other defensive tools to keep myself alive, and then try and save Shroud for blowing someone's head off. Because again, Shroud is really good at blowing people's heads off now. But it is interesting, like, it took me a long time, like the first couple weeks after the patch, I was really despairing about the state of Reaper, like, for a while, because I was still running like my old build. I was just dying all the time. I just never had life force, and it was like, oh, they completely killed it. And then I kind of started adjusting my thinking, and all of a sudden I found that no, you just play it different now. Now, I would still like to see the degeneration come down. I think 4% would be a good sweet spot, because again, I think there's like a line at 5% where just 5% is just over that line where it's still too much. And I think going down to 4%, which was our original degeneration rate before they started messing with it. Because, you know, from like 2012 until August of this year, 4% was the base generation, unless you were running Vital Persistence. And then they decided to start messing with it. And honestly, just go back to 4%, it was fine. But again, now that I've acclimated to how the build crafting is, you know, you build around out of Shroud survivability with Shroud as a backup. It's much better. Like, I've been actually liking how it's performing. Obviously, like, you get wrecked by Scourges now because you can't buffer their damage with Shroud as well. But, you know, most builds in this game get completely train wrecked by Scourges right now. We're hardly the only class having issues in that department. So, that's not a huge thing. Obviously, you want to be mindful of the fact Scourges will wreck you in your gameplay, and you want to avoid trying to 1v1 them and so forth. But for the most part, now that I've kind of, acclimated to how Reaper works, I can perform much better. If you look at the videos I've put up, I did fairly well for myself in those matches, I like to think. So again, it's definitely workable, it's definitely still viable. It is not a meta build just because Scourge has completely and utterly replaced Reaper in all game modes, because Scourge is just insane. Like, it is basically... Scourge does everything Reaper used to do. Like, it's a cleave spec with boon hate. It just does it better. But hopefully the devs will come to their senses, it'll get nerfed, and we might have some interclass balance between Scourge and Reaper. And I think the devs did say, I think it was Reddit where they said this, there was a comment by one of the devs saying that they are considering some changes that will come a lot sooner than their quarterly balance patches, as in some hot fixes to, they didn't say what, they didn't single Scourge out or anything. But apparently, they are recognizing the need that, maybe some things are a big enough balance issue that they need to get handled a lot sooner than a quarterly patch. Which is, it's a good thing to see. Because there's nothing more infuriating to have a bad meta that's not fun to play and go on for months.